This man, Mao Zedong, brought a country of 540 million peasant people into the modern world. He did it after half a century of war and civil war. He used communism to bind the people together. He led the Chinese Communist Party for 42 years. Mao was 7 years old when the 20th century began. His father was a peasant who owned land round this farm. Because Mao was clever, his father wanted him to keep the farm accounts. But Mao had other ideas. The peasant boy from the provinces watched as the rule of the Empress Dowager in Peking gave way to chaos. In 1912, the Kuomintang was formed, a people's party under Sun Yat-sen. Mao Zedong, at first a student, then a teacher, then a librarian, read widely in history and politics. He began to see how badly managed China was. Most of her ports and industries were controlled by foreign powers. Shanghai, under the British and the French, was China's greatest port. It was here that Mao's revolution began. In 1921, oddly enough in a girls' school, the founders of the Chinese Communist Party met for the first time. Mao was among them. They agreed to join forces with the Kuomintang. Many parts of the country were dominated by local warlords. The Kuomintang army, now backed by communists, marched against them. Mao later went to the province of Jiangxi to organize a peasant army. There in Jiangxi, he was confirmed in his belief that the Chinese peasant was the real key to revolution in China. By 1927, the Kuomintang campaign against the warlords was well underway. But jealousy of the communists within the Kuomintang led to a purge, and this spelt disaster for the communists. In a kind of night of the long knives in Shanghai, communist leaders were killed. Luckily, Mao was out of Shanghai. Some communists escaped to their few remaining strongholds, like Jiangxi.
I introduce to the audience the President of the National Government.
The new leader of the Kuomintang was Chiang Kai-shek.
Long live free people's principle. Long live the revolutionary spirit of the nationalist China.
Chiang hated communism. He ordered his troops to surround the communist bases. They slowly tightened the noose in a series of extermination campaigns. By 1934, Mao knew that his Red Army must either fight its way out or die. So 100,000 set out on the legendary Long March, a trek of 6,000 miles that took them a year. Kuomintang forces harassed the marchers. During the Long March, at a town called Sunyi, Mao was elected chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. Then, to avoid the Kuomintang, the communist armies split up. Mao led one army himself. Though there was discord, the marchers eventually reached communist-held territory in the northwest. Only 30,000 survived. They set up their base around the little town of Yan'an. They lived in caves carved in the hillside. A young American journalist, Edgar Snow, managed to reach Mao in Yan'an.
when he began to talk to me about his plans for the future of China and the revolution, at first it sounded fantastic because he had only this tiny little area and small band with him, but the way in which he presented his program and his ideas was so logical and so convincing that he, in the end, had me believing that he was truly an exceptional person.
Edgar Snow also filmed Mao's army. It was a time of planning and preparing. Their soldiers were trained to spread a political message, that the peasants didn't have to starve and be exploited, that China could be run in a reasonable way. The peasants had never known soldiers to behave like this before. They had to help the people, pay for everything they needed, leave everything clean, respect women, never damage crops. In 1937, Japan began all-out war on China. Now Chiang Kai-shek and the communists were faced with a common enemy. The communists called for a united front of all Chinese to fight Japan. The Americans and British who supported the Kuomintang called on Chiang Kai-shek to accept the surrender of the Japanese in 1945. The Americans made some attempt to bring the communists into a coalition Chinese government. But it all came to nothing. Civil war followed. The Kuomintang at first had enormous superiority in numbers and modern weapons, but their forces were ill-trained and badly paid. By the summer of 1948, the Kuomintang army was losing ground. Mao chose Lin Piao as his military commander to plan the final struggle. A few months more, and the Kuomintang was in full retreat. The remnant took refuge on the island of Taiwan, where the Americans continued to support them. Mao Zedong was approaching the moment for which he'd planned and fought for more than 20 years. On the 1st of October 1949, Mao stood with his colleagues on the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Peking and proclaimed the new People's Republic of China. The problems were daunting. China was starving and in ruins. Mao and his colleagues started forcefully. Big landlords, especially those who dealt harshly with the peasants, were condemned by so-called people's courts. Many were killed. The deeds of ownership to their land were burnt. Their possessions were shared out. Many peasants received a plot of land for the first time. The Korean War in 1950 brought China into conflict with the United Nations. When, in October, United Nations troops took the North Koreans back to the Chinese border, Mao immediately sent so-called volunteers across the Yalu River into Korea. The Communist Chinese forces won great success against the United Nations. Mao wanted to spur on the great mass of the Chinese people to new achievements by their own efforts. With the mid-50s came the farming collectives. A collective was the joining together of peasant smallholdings into a bigger unit. More schools were opened. Peasants were trained as part-time soldiers. Mao was confident, ready to welcome criticism. In 1957, with the slogan, "Let 100 flowers bloom," he called on intellectuals to say what they thought about the government. In 1958 came the Great Leap Forward, an all-out effort to bring China abreast of the Western industrialized world. Orders went out to create industry in the countryside. All over China, peasants tried to produce steel in their own backyard furnaces. Work hard for 3 years, be happy for 1,000, ran the slogan. An organization man, Liu Shaoqi, took over as head of state. But the Great Leap Forward failed to produce the results that were hoped for. China just wasn't ready to carry it out with the speed the leaders wanted. Failure of the Great Leap was a setback for China, and 3 years of bad weather and bad harvests made matters worse. The people went hungry. Though there was hardship, the system of rationing prevented widespread starvation. In 1960, Khrushchev visited Peking. Behind the smiles, distrust and suspicion were growing between China and the Soviet Union. Perhaps China was advancing too fast. Russia broke a promise to help with a nuclear bomb. The split widened. The Russians recalled all their technicians and set back important schemes of industrial advance for years. Yet in 1963, without Russian help, China detonated her first nuclear weapon. But Chairman Mao was unhappy at the growing power of Chinese bureaucracy, so he tried to break it in 1966 by starting a nationwide cultural revolution. In a little red book were set out his thoughts on how the people should live and work. Lin Piao, at that time Mao's declared successor, spoke to thousands of teenage Red Guards in Peking. In the name of the Cultural Revolution, they set out to destroy the establishment. Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, added her own ideas. She demanded a revolution in the arts. Schools and universities closed. Red Guards set out on a violent campaign against all that recalled the old world. When all the chaos of the Cultural Revolution had died away, Mao sought to rally the country. More important than the revolution in farms and factories was to be the revolution inside the new Chinese man. Meanwhile, in the north, Russians and Chinese clashed over border territories. Chinese leaders saw the Soviet Union as a growing threat. The newsreels gave voice to their fears.
Our lives may be sacrificed, but not a single inch of the sacred territory of our motherland must be lost.
By now, Mao was well into his 70s. He was ill, but along with others like Zhou Enlai, he'd seen the revolution through, and he wanted it to go on. He firmly believed that revolution was vital to China's industrial progress. The commune, some with 60,000 people, had already replaced the farming collectives. Mao had improved the living standards of hundreds of millions of Chinese. In the minds of his people, he towered above the other leaders. The thoughts of Chairman Mao were the subject of children's songs. His political writings were quoted to support whatever policy or line the government decided to follow. Mao was still the great revered leader when he died in September 1976. Those like his widow were soon replaced. The leadership of the world's largest nation fell to Hua Ku-feng. Yet it was a nation still dominated by the memory of Mao Zedong.